let's get it started. Our presenter, Amy, serves as an extension horticulture specialist at Oregon State University. Her role involves teaching and outreach to the community on commercial horticulture, particularly in Central Oregon's high desert environment. She collaborates with homeowners and professionals in green industry, specializing in sustainable landscape practices. Her expertise include water-wise gardening, fire-wise landscaping, and backyard food production. And with that, I will hand it over to you, Amy.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. It's all to you.
Okay. Just a little background. So I primarily work with community horticulture. I train Master Gardener volunteers for a Tri-County region, and I am on the high side or the high desert side of Oregon. So I have a very dry environment, and learned about landscape horticulture, which is what I specialized in school at Colorado State University. So have some familiarity with similar environment there at Utah. This is an overview of what we'll talk about, and I'll just go into a little bit of detail. So I am not, just for background again, my specialty really is landscape horticulture and cultural care and practices. I'm not a fire scientist. I don't have that experience. So I really am just talking about creating a defensible space as it relates to landscape plant material and the use of fire-resistant type plants. So I'd like to start off by just talking about some basics here. And the first is what's known as the fire triangle. These are the three elements or components you need to have a fire exist. Most people are familiar with this. The second triangle here is what's called the fire behavior triangle. And these are the factors that influence the rate or the speed of the fire and the intensity of the fire. And what you'll notice with these two triangles, if we look at both of them together, is that the common denominator between the two is fuel, which thankfully is the one element that we can influence or change. So for purposes of this presentation, fuel is going to be anything that burns. And so without the proper amount of arrangement of a fuel, a fire can't burn. So I'm primarily going to be focusing on the plant material side of things, not really the structural or home elements, although we know that plays an important role. So two factors that have emerged as the primary determinants of a home's ability to survive a wildfire is the home's roofing materials and the quality of the defensible space. And so today I'll focus more in on the defensible space aspect of that. I thought it might be interesting to share this research if you haven't seen this. It's been out for about 1.5 years now, but this was some research done by some scientists, one of which was out of Oregon State University. And what they found in looking at a collection of over 22,000 fires is that more than 60% of the cross-boundary fires were ignited on private property. And so I find that interesting, and it tells me the story that it's important for us to be talking to homeowners, particularly in an urban environment, as well as the wildland-urban interface, based on some of this research. So I just throw that out there for you to do some follow-up if you like this type, looking at this type of research. This is an interesting story to read, or interesting research to read. So in talking about defensible space, there's what's known as the home ignition zone. And this infographic was recently developed here at OSU Extension, where we're showing some things to be thinking about in your own space. Whether you have a large lot or a small lot, you can use all the same principles here. And things, for example, on the recommended side, like making sure you have spacing between plant groupings or shrub groupings, using alternatives or low-growing ground covers, making sure they're stayed and mowed low, having gravel around the home, making sure you're limbing up your trees and shrubs that are in the perimeter and that sort of thing, versus what's on the not recommended side, where you'll see the use of roof material is recommended, not using the cedar shake roofs, collecting debris that collects in the gutters and on the roof line, making sure plant material is not touching the roof line. So just an infographic to kind of give homeowners an example of things to be looking for, things they can start to work through as a checklist to be doing to help create a defensible space. So the home ignition zone is divided into 3 zones here. You see the first 0 to 5 feet around the home. It's no longer recommended that any plant material go in that area. And then you see in that 5 to 30 foot area is where you can start to introduce irrigated plant material or plant material that's going to be able to keep moisture in it throughout the growing season. And then beyond that is the 30 to 100 foot zone. So we'll talk a little bit more detail about these 3 different home ignition zones. And this is information coming from, we adapted the National Fire Protection Association standards for the home ignition zone. So here's just some examples of a homeowner. This was a homeowner in the Bend area where I live near. And they're starting, this is a Firewise neighborhood that's trying to adapt more defensible space practices. And so this was a homeowner that started to change his landscape over. He had wood bark mulch all the way up to the house and had some plant material all the way up to the house. And so he's adapting to using no plant material in that 0 to 5 foot immediate zone. And so you can see the conversion here from the wood bark mulch. He's starting to pull that back and away in phases and replace it with non-combustible mulching material, in this case, decorative rock. Here's another example. This is a high density urban housing development, but again, an example of some types of landscaping you could have in that area and keeping the flammable plant material away from the perimeter of the home in that first 0 to 5 feet. The next zone is the intermediate zone. And this is going to be the area where you can introduce plant material more easily, and you want to be using ground covers, shrubs, and maybe sparingly you can use some trees here, but you want to be thinking and be thoughtful about the design and the spacing. Make sure you've got vegetation clear and separated. I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. If you have lawns or alternatives, you want to keep them low, mowed to 4 inches or lower. And you want to be removing ladder fuels, which I'll discuss in a minute here. But spacing can easily be achieved through planning, removal of existing plants, and or maintenance. So before we get too much further, I want to make sure everyone knows what a ladder fuel is, because this is an important component of creating a defensible space. So ladder fuels can be defined as fuels such as branches, shrubs, or understory layer of trees. And it's such that they're arranged in a continuous layer from the ground up that allow a fire to spread or ladder upwards, going from a surface fire up to a crown fire. And then we run into where embers can be shooting quite a far distance from those crown fires and landing on structures and that sort of thing. So, and we know that embers can create quite a hazard in burning down structures. So the idea is to remove the ladder fuels, or be really aware of the where the ladder fuels are, and so that you can try and remove them and remove that potential continuous fuel. So in doing site visits, sometimes we'll go and do site visits at these neighborhoods, and just walking around with the homeowners and simple things, just, making sure that they're removing the conifers from the roof line. In this case, they had both conifers and pretty tall ornamental grasses. This is the Karl Forster featherweed grass that's commonly used, and just having folks be thoughtful in removing that and getting it away from the home. Here's another example of a home that used an alternative ground cover, predominantly Delosperma, or commonly known as ice plant, instead of lawn, and then they use the large river rocks for more of a mulching material. So the real purpose behind creating a Firewise landscape and helping to create that defensible space is to create an attractive landscape, but at the same time, not be adding to the fire potential or hazard. Here's an example here. You can see these are aspen trees in the background, and they're going to be considered a fire resistant plant to help break up those fuel ladders. And in the foreground of this slide, you can see that there are some seedlings that have come up, some pine trees, and it would be a good idea to go ahead and remove those. And so you're trying to remove some of that potential fuel. Here are some recommendations, again, adapted from the National Fire Protection Association. I'll kind of get a little bit closer here. So outside of that, in that intermediate zone from 5 to 30 feet, here are the recommendations if you have clusters of trees being used in that area. The idea being that you have 18 feet between the treetops from cluster to cluster. And as you move further out and you get out to the extended zone, which is the furthest zone out, then you can start to, those can be a little bit closer, and you can see it goes from 18 feet to 12 feet. And then as you get to 60 feet or out, if you have that much area, then it would get even smaller to where you have 6 feet between the treetops. The same recommendations can be made for the intermediate zone as it relates to shrubs. And shrubs are the worst offenders when it comes to being ladder fuel. So you want to be thoughtful if you have shrubs, shrub borders, shrub clusters, groupings of shrubs with your perennials, that when you're planting them, you're really allowing room between individual plants, depending on the arrangement, or between the actual clumps or groupings of shrubs. So for example, in this picture, if you have a shrub that at maturity being the key word there, at maturity gets to about 3 feet wide, you really wouldn't want to put the next shrub any closer than 6 feet, so that you're basically going in, and in this case, you'd be removing these shrubs to allow for that spacing, so that if this plant was to catch fire, that it wouldn't be right on top of another plant. Here's an example that included a fire-resistant landscape. This was the home of a retired fire chief in Bend, and he put low-growing plant material closest to the home or the perimeter of the home. And then in that intermediate zone is where he put lawn as a defensible space and part of his Firewise landscape. He also had things related to the structure of the home, like composite roof, hardy plank siding, tempered glass windows, that sort of thing. But here's another view, and you can see here as it transitions out into that extended zone, which is more native plant material. He's right there in the Deschutes forest, so you can see the ponderosa pine in the background. And I'll show you another view of how he did some work there to keep that area more fire-wise. So when limbing and pruning plant material, keeping it well maintained, ideally you want to take plants out that are below large trees that are potentially fire prone. You want to limb up to at least 3 times the height of whatever is beneath it. So in this case, you had a 3-foot shrub, you'd want to limb up at least to 9 feet. If you kind of want a default number, generally speaking, you can use 10 feet as removing all living and non-living limbs, again, to remove those ladder fuels. If you have tall grass or shrubs or ground covers underneath in a windy place or on a slope, you want to make that number higher so you're actually limbing up even taller than that. So here's an example of a tree that would be a good idea to go ahead and take the limbs off the lower part of this tree. You can see there's tall grasses around. There's some other potential debris on the ground that can be a fuel source. You'd want to remove all that. So here's what it looks like at a different site that specifically you want to be pruning up those branches. And this is helping to create that defensible space. Here's a side view of that home I showed you just a few slides back, and you can see here the pines have all been limbed up and the grass remains quite low. So this is an example of a home that was a part of the skeleton that was in the skeleton fire in Bend, Oregon, a number of years ago. This homeowner had done some thinning and limbing of trees and had some green space around the entire home. And the fire mostly went around the home, yet unfortunately the home was almost lost because they had a couple of shrubs that were fire prone right up against the home. It was ornamental juniper. And although they had done a pretty good job creating a defensible space further out, they didn't think about the arrangement and the type of plant material closest to the home. And unfortunately, a firebrand came and ignited the home. It came in and hit the ornamental juniper, and then it caught fire and started going up and around the home, conveying the fire up and around the home. And as you can see, it kind of scorched the roof line here. Fortunately, this home was safe because the wildfire fighters were in the area and they were able to get in there and put it out. Topography plays a role in how wildfires move. And so here's an infographic just showing on flat ground, the heat and the smoke plume just goes straight up versus if you have upslope or downslope, it's going to affect how the fire moves, and particularly if wind's involved. So slope allows the flame to preheat the fuels above, making the fire move more quickly. So this is something to consider if you live in an area that's, if you're upslope or downslope, you want to be thinking about how that may impact creating that defensible space. So here's an example of a homeowner. He cleared some native vegetation out away from his home on the downslope side. He limbed up some of those conifers, and then he put in some kind of a rock wall there, and then was planning to put fire-resistant plant material right in that rock wall, right in this area where you see that. So transitioning from some of those examples onto what fire resistance means, because it's somewhat of a loaded word. And it has a couple of different meanings depending on how you're using it. So in the ecological sense, fire resistant means being able to persist over a long period of time in a fire-dominated environment. Strategies like sprouting and specialized seeds that remain dormant allows the plants to persist in a fire-dominated ecosystem. So that's more the ecological definition of the term. But for our purposes here today, I'm talking about fire resistance, meaning the ability to resist ignition and not sustain continued combustion. So for example, does the foliage burst into flames when a match is held to it, or does it just smolder and go out? So that's what I'm referring to when I'm talking about fire resistant plants as I go more into that. Defensible space can work, and having fire resistant vegetation within that 30-foot irrigated zone can help reduce the fire hazard. This is an example again of the skeleton fire that occurred in Bend. And you can see here the ponderosa pine that burned around this area. The fire actually went around this home because of their defensible space. It was a pretty intense fire. It actually burned a garage and almost another home off to the right of the slide here. But this home was protected because of the choice of using turf grass, and also the ponderosa pine were able to actually absorb some of that heat, even though they can have some fire-prone tendencies. Here's the home 7 years after the fire. And you can see it's interesting. I'd like showing this photo just because it's interesting to see how these ponderosa pine actually survived that wildfire. Some of the buds on the pine survived and they were able to continue to grow post-fire. But just to actually see the landscape around too. And so this home looked like this 7 years, and then I took a photo more recently. I was able to go back, and this is what the home looks like 25 years post-fire. And it looks like they put some landscaping back in here. Some of it I'd question maybe not as ideal choices. And here's what it looks like, the three of those. So characteristics of highly flammable plant material. Things that contain volatile waxes, terpenes, or oils tend to be more fire prone. Anything that collects dead material debris as it exfoliates, as the leaves come off, something that has sap that's gummy or resinous, or maybe a strong odor, or it could be a plant material that the characteristic of the plant is such that the bark is peely or papery, those types of things. Now, if a plant has only one of these traits, it may or may not be flammable, but if it has several of these traits, it's more likely to be more fire prone or flammable. Here's a close-up. You cut away from that juniper that looks green, like it may be more fire resistant, but then you cut away and you see the close-up of how it collects dead needles from within and becomes more fire prone, not to mention that it also has oils that are fire prone in the foliage, in the branches. So here's some examples of some fire prone plants to avoid. Sometimes they're native, sometimes it's the non-native ornamentals. Arborvitae is such a commonly used plant, and I just took the opportunity. This was at a neighbor's house. They cut away some of this, I think, for visual reasons, pulling out of a driveway, but you can see the debris again that collects in the arborvitae. So here's an example of the Oak Knoll fire that occurred. This was August 2010. And that main street you see there is I-5, which is the main interstate in Oregon that runs north to south and from Portland on down. And in this case, this was in an area that was not considered part of the wildfire hazard zone. It was a total of 16 acres that were burned. The origin of the fire you can see here it was human caused. And then it quickly, because of the wind, picked up, and you had spotting across the freeway simultaneously at the same time going on. And it hopped across the street, and over 16 acres were burned across the street over on this side. And 11 homes were also lost, unfortunately. Here's a close-up of the neighborhood. This is the neighborhood where the neighbors' homes burned down. And one of the primary determinants in those homes burning down was there was a lot of use of the Leyland cypress. And so that being a fire-prone plant really contributed to the loss of structure here in this case. So characteristics of fire-resistant plants include leaves that tend to be moist or supple, and that they hold that moisture throughout the growing season as the season progresses. You have trees that are clean when they defoliate. Most of the broadleaf deciduous trees are going to be more fire resistant plants, but you also have some thick leafed evergreens, for example, like rhododendron and those types of plants. So these are some of the primary characteristics that make a plant more fire resistant. And again, just to emphasize, fire resistant doesn't mean that it doesn't burn. It just means it usually doesn't sustain a burn or contribute to the fire with high intensity. Generally, the sap is water-like and typically does not have a strong odor in these types of plants as well. And here are some examples. Other things to consider is that moisture changes seasonally. So a plant may hold more moisture in the beginning of the season versus as it progresses through, and that will change the fire resistance of plants. So you want to be looking at plants that hold moisture the most. Those are the ones you should be putting close to the home. Environmental factors also affect plant characteristics, not to mention the maintenance of the plant material. So really important that plants are well maintained. If they're well maintained, these fire resistant plants have the potential to slow down the fire, shorten flame length, and reduce the amount of heat coming from the fire. But the condition of the plant's really critical, and even fire resistant plants are going to burn if they're poorly maintained or insufficiently watered. Pruning is a really important component of taking care of fire resistant plants or fire prone plants. In the case of this example, these individual spruce, I call them spruce on a stick, up against the home here. Unfortunately, they went too far back in the pruning. And you can see also on the mugo pine, same thing. So now you have this dead wood, and you've created more dead wood by improper pruning. So there's a close-up of that. So you want to make sure your landscaping practices are consistent with keeping your plants healthy to maintain that fire resistance. Here's an example of, what does this actually look like in real life examples? This is a wildfire that broke out at a construction site when sparks from cutting pipe or rebar were ignited by dry fuels. The fire burned grass and native bitterbrush, sagebrush, and a mix of pine. And it went up slope where there's lots of homes. This is a Butte residential area in the city of Bend. And you can see here where the fire moved across, a little bit closer there. So the fire exploded with some native plants and landscape shrubs and then continued to move off to the right here. Here's what that looks like close up. This is the home that was most affected by this wildfire or by this fire, and what the burned vegetation looked like at the top of the slope where those mugo pines and spruce were located. You can see they were pretty much completely consumed. And if you look closer here, you can see off to the left in the slide here that there's some bubbling of the paint just from the radiant heat here. And some of the scorching that occurred around the home just from the heat of those shrubs. Here's another photo of that same home where the mugo pines were located. And so here circled are the mugo pines. The heat from those mugo pines was directed at the large aspen tree, which would be considered a fire-resistant type plant. Has pretty moist leaves and that sort of thing, clean trunks as far as the trunk texture goes. And in this case, the mugo pines, the flames went in the direction of the aspen, which the aspen in return absorbed and deflected a lot of that convective and radiant heat that would have been directed to the home. So here's an example. You can see that aspen burned, but it really helped to slow it down in time for the fire to be put out without greatly affecting the home. This is the home next to that previous one. The fire moved across the slope where the firefighters were walking, and the green hedge in front of this house is Arctic willow. Here's what it looked like. You can see all the native plant material burned in the foreground here. Again, the heat was directed upslope in this case. So here's what it looks like close up of the Arctic willow, and it took the brunt of the heat from below. And again, being a fire-resistant type plant, that was a good thing because it slowed this fire down. Directly behind that shrub border of willow was mugo pine, and thankfully it didn't breach through that willow to get to the mugo pine, which is closest to the home. So in a case like this, the recommendation would be to take those mugo pine out. So these are just some tips and a checklist as it relates to landscape practices and creating a defensible space. There are lots of other things you can do to create a defensible space as it relates to structure and building materials. But if you have to just start somewhere, you can use a checklist like this, where you're just starting simply by taking material out of the gutters, removing debris from directly around the home, starting to transition potentially the mulching material you may have used if it's combustible to non-combustible, and those types of things. Research sources that are available to you. Well, some of the, here's one from Mike Coons, and I know there has been other ones available through Utah State University. So this has a list of plant material. You can go either to the website directly through Utah State, or in this case, it was a PDF linked, and has a good list of plant materials that are potential plants that can be used in a Firewise landscape. There are several other university publications circulating. There's usually what I recommend is if somebody is interested and they're from a different state, to just do a Google search using what I have here at the bottom of the screen, where you put in fire resistant plants and put in this qualifier, the word site :edu, and that'll bring up research-based information for you. One of the newer publications that we just actually published just last week, really, we got it fully up in the PDF, is Fire Resistant Plants for Home Landscapes. This is a publication that was a revision of one that I worked on with Steve Fitzgerald long time ago, and we finally did the revision. I have several co-authors that I worked with. And this guide is a pictorial plant guide, so it has a little bit of information up front on creating a defensible space, but it's mostly a pictorial plant guide on plants that are considered to be more fire resistant. And we put the information in regarding the plants. And then in this go around, we tried to include, the basic information about water use, if it attracts pollinators. Here, the circle with the N is if it's a plant that's native to the area or has native species that are similar, that would be considered Firewise. That was included. And then we also tried to address if there's invasive plants. This guide in particular is for the Pacific Northwest as a whole. So we had to put a lot in there about invasive plants because we've got a lot of variation. This information, where did we get the information for fire-resistant plant material? Because there's not a tremendous amount of research that's been done on fire-resistant plants. It's pretty intensive work, and so I pulled from this fire-resistant plant master database out of Southern Idaho, and some of the content they looked at was moisture and mineral content, volatile oil content, and they looked at height and width to give a fire resistance score to certain ornamental type plants. And so we use this as a way to help revise our pictorial plant guide. There are some other plant guides out there that we cross-referenced, and some of the things that have been looked at, for example, out of this one, ignitability, sustainability, those are the types of components being looked at for the research. But there hasn't been a tremendous body, there really isn't a tremendous body of work done on fire-resistant plants. And so the ones in the guide that we just put out are all ones that I was able to find some research on the plant material. Some people will choose just to use the characteristics to make an informed decision about whether or not to include a plant. Okay, so now I'm just going to transition into some fire-resistant plants that may be good choices. And it could be that depending on the area you're from, you'd want to check and make sure that these are good choices to introduce into the landscape and make sure they're not invasive for your area. When I get asked, about the use of conifers or ornamental grasses, what I tell individuals is, if you're going to choose to use something like that, you probably want to isolate it and take it further back away from the home, put it in that intermediate zone or even in the extended zone. And so it's not that maybe you can't use that at all, but you just want to be really thoughtful in placement and make sure there's nothing around it that it would contribute greatly to a fire. So I'm going to go through just a couple of plants that can be included as fire-resistant plants and things to look at when you're selecting plant material for a landscape always. In particular, as it relates to being Firewise, mature size is going to be a critical component, making sure you recognize how big is that plant going to get at full maturity, so you're not having to replace it or improperly prune it, and then non-invasive as well. So low growing ground covers, you can use a variety of different times. I'm showing woolly thyme here just because it's extremely drought tolerant. Low growing to the ground, can be steppable. I'm going to move through these pretty fast because they're all available in the fire resistant plant guide that we have if you want more information on them. Dead nettle is another low growing ground cover that can be used. This one can do shade depart sun. Another one that's commonly used is called snow in summer. It's got that silvery gray foliage, makes it more drought tolerant. White flowers, likes full sun. Close up of that blossom. Creeping phlox, a real popular ornamental ground cover, can be used. This one you want to pay attention to because sometimes they can get a little bit ratty and dry out, and so you'll want to make sure you're properly maintaining this one as it's post-bloom. But lots of variety of color choices here, likes full sun. Sedum is going to be a great fire-resistant plant, one of the better ones to use, especially closest to the home. And so here are two different sedums side by side. You've got the variegated foliage on this one. This one has more of a reddish foliage. to it. And here's another type of sedum. So lots of different choices when it comes to sedum, lots of different foliage color, flower color. Here's one that's in bloom with pink flowers, attracts the pollinators. And similar to sedum would be Delosperma or ice plant. Now, and this is not to be confused with the ice plant that's invasive in places like California. Delosperma is a good choice. And there's lots of different varieties. The hardy yellow ice plant likes full sun, very drought tolerant. Here are just some of the different varieties of that particular plant. Lots and lots of choices as far as penstemons go. Here, this one I'm showing is the pine leaf penstemon. You can see a close up of the bloom. It's one of the longer blooming perennials, so it's a good choice if you keep it going there. And lots of different choices too as far as the flower colors. There's yellow, there's the orange red, there's kind of something in between, looks more like a mango colored. There's native penstemon that you can consider. Lots and lots of choices here for a good Firewise plant. Yarrow can be used. It will spread. Some are inclined to spread more than others, so you can do your homework on, we list in the guide ones that are less likely to become spreaders, but you've got both native and non-native yarrow that can be used. And some people will use the yarrow as an alternative ground cover and just keep it mowed. Western yarrow is one of the natives. Blue flax can be used. It's another native wildflower. Sun rose is one of the fire-resistant plants, another more ground cover type plant. Daylily, lots of choices there. And you've got a variety of colors. Red hot poker can be used in some cases, and they come in a different variety of flower colors as well. Yuccas are a good fire-resistant type plant like full sun. There's ones you want to keep cleaned out because they can collect some dead leaf material, and once post-bloom, you'll want to remove the bloom stalks. Caromachy Daphne is going to be another one, more of a broadleaf, semi-broadleaf evergreen. And the lilacs, you've got the French hybrids that are going to stay smaller in size would probably be a better choice than maybe the common lilacs, but they like full sun. Of course, you've got lots of different varieties of flower colors on the lilacs. Lewis mock orange is going to be another one that can be used, or some of the ornamental mock orange. Got red twig dogwood or Rhodosia dogwood. Of course, they got nice winter texture. And then you can use some of the smaller versions of this, like the Kelsey dogwood that stays small and rounded, be a good choice. Golden currant is another one. Western spirea can be used. And then moving on to trees, you can use the red maple hybrids. Aspen can be used as a good one. We saw a good example of how that can work. Swedish aspen has a more upright form. Variety of crabapple trees, if you can plant those in your area, those can be good options for a fire-wise landscape. Of course, you've got lots and lots of choices of growth habit, flower color, fruitless. These are just a few of the ones that we have in our demonstration garden. Chokecherry, there's both native and non-native. And there's the Schubert chokecherry. That's a popular landscape choice for its maroon or reddish foliage. Serviceberry, there are both native serviceberry shrubs and you can use ornamental serviceberry trees. They have a nice growth habit, kind of an open canopy that would lend itself well to a Firewise landscape. Has nice fruit set and nice fall color. So that